shots were shot on my first camera that you can now buy for just $800. And the camera that I'm talking about is the Sony a7S II. The truth is that when we're just starting our careers out as filmmakers, we can't afford to go out and buy the most expensive cinema cameras. We need a camera to get started and to help us grow our skills as filmmakers. And that is what we're going to talk about today, how you can get the most out of your cheap camera to make sure that you're still capturing beautiful cinematic footage. Before we jump into this video, I just want to let you guys know we are doing a giveaway of a shotgun microphone, and all you have to do is like and subscribe to the channel and comment down below, "Can you hear me now?" and you will be eligible to win this microphone for free, no strings attached. Let's first talk about the biggest problem with cheap cameras. The biggest problem that you're going to run into is your camera's dynamic range. Now, the most simple way that I could describe what this is on your camera is the ability for your camera to capture highlights without blowing them out and shadows without crushing them. Most cheap cameras don't have high dynamic range. They're probably somewhere between 9, 11, or maybe even 12 stops of dynamic range, which means that they're not going to be very good at capturing highlights without blowing them out or capturing shadows without crushing them. Now, the question is, what can you do? The first thing that I would suggest is when you are filming on a cheap camera, you need to be able to control your lighting as much as possible. When you're outside, try to avoid harsh sunlight, because the chances are you're going to blow out your highlights and it's going to be a nightmare to grade. When I shot my first indie film on this camera, I made sure to avoid shooting outside between the hours of 9 a.m. and 4 p.m. And the reason why I say this is because the sun at that point is right overhead, and the shadows casted by the buildings or the trees make it extremely hard to properly expose your image. So I made it a point that every time we had an exterior shot, I made sure that we did it in ambient light, which means that we shot between the hours of 5 to 8 o'clock in the morning, and then we shot at sunset from about 5 o'clock to 8 o'clock at night. And I would say that if you're indoors and you don't have access to lighting equipment, I would say your best bet is to use windows to your advantage. And if the light coming in is too bright, try putting a white cloth or some sort of diffusion outside the window or even on the inside of the window to diffuse some of that light coming in. And remember, the bigger the light source, the better and softer it's going to be. It is extremely important that while you're using a cheaper camera that has low dynamic range, that any light that you use is extremely soft. And when you do this, you're going to find it a lot easier to get those really cinematic shots, and it's going to be easier to color grade your footage. Another really important factor to getting cinematic shots is understanding how to properly expose your camera. And for those of you who don't know, here's a quick rundown. What you're going to want to do is use your histogram to make sure that you're not overexposed on your highlights and you're not underexposed on your shadows. A good rule of thumb, especially when you have a cheap camera, is to make sure that most of the information being captured is in the middle of that histogram. But there are going to be some situations where it's going to be very hard to do this, and that is where ND filters come into play. Cheap cameras do not come with internal ND filters, so to be able to properly expose your shots, especially in really bright lighting conditions, is to get yourself a good ND filter. Taking a look at this interview right here, you can obviously tell that everything outside the window is completely blown out. And you can even see this on the histogram. Now, after using an ND filter, the image is properly exposed, and now I can start to light my subject. One of the quickest ways that you can take your cinematography to the next level and hide the fact that you are using a cheap camera is shooting against the light. I talk about this all the time on the channel because once I figured this out, it absolutely blew my mind. The idea is shooting on the shadow side of your subject. You're gonna be able to get a lot more interesting shots than if you were to shoot something straight on the bright side of your subject. Every quote unquote cinematic shot that you see is using this technique in one way or another. This one sounds obvious, but another really easy way to improve your cheap camera is by using good, interesting lenses. And the cool thing is that you could buy a really awesome vintage lens right now for like 150 to 300 bucks. Most cheap cameras that you buy come with a kit lens or just a lens that's like way too sharp, has absolutely no character, and gives it like this video format look. But if you go and you get something like a Helios 44mm, this is an extremely affordable lens that gives you a lot of character to your image. It has really interesting bokeh, and it gives you a really soft, creamy image that kind of hides the fact that you're shooting on a cheap camera. I have seen some really amazing images come out of these really old lenses, and that's just because it has so much character. Now with these old lenses, you're not gonna get a really sharp and detailed image. You're gonna get something that has a lot of character to it and that has a lot more interesting bokeh and a really nice roll off of the highlights. So if you are using a cheap camera, go online on like eBay or maybe even Amazon and just look up some old vintage lenses and see what you come across. The last thing that you're going to want to focus on to make your cheap camera look and feel more expensive is to focus on stabilization. Now, a lot of filmmakers, when they think of stabilization, they think of like a Ronin gimbal or like a Zhiyun crane. And while those are great for specific things, that's not really what I'm talking about. When I got myself a top handle and I got myself the Easy Rig, that helped a lot, because if you're trying to shoot handheld without a top handle, you're not gonna have that extra point of contact that's gonna keep your footage stabilized. And you'd be surprised how stable you can get your footage just by adding a top handle. Now, by having the Easy Rig, it lightens the load of your camera and it makes it feel like it weighs nothing. And it does help a little bit with the stabilization, but more importantly, it allows you to kind of focus on balancing the camera instead of focusing all your strength and energy just by holding the camera up. Most cheap cameras won't have in-body stabilization, so by focusing on getting smooth, stable shots, you're definitely gonna make your footage look a lot better. And another great way to stabilize your footage is to shoot in higher frame rates like 50 or 60 frames, slow your footage down and use Warp Stabilizer in Premiere to be able to get that super smooth, stabilized look. So if you're shooting B-roll in a run and gun situation, and if it doesn't matter that that footage is shot in slow motion, go ahead and fire it off on 50 or 60 frames, throw Warp Stabilizer on it, and I promise you, you're gonna get yourself a really stable shot. I'm shocked like every time I use it. So just to give a quick recap on everything that we talked about, the first thing that you're going to want to do is control your lighting situation as much as you possibly can. That means shooting in ambient light and the right times of day. Try your best to avoid shooting in harsh sunlight to avoid that really harsh contrast. And if you're inside, use window light to your advantage. And if you are using lights, make sure that you have diffusion on them, because the softer the light, the better. Or you're even diffusing the window light that's coming into your locations. Then of course, don't forget about the ND filter, because when you are using a cheap camera, you gotta be able to control those highlights, so I highly suggest getting a really good ND filter. Make sure you use that cinematography trick, shooting against the light on the dark side of your subject to get those really interesting shadows and a more cinematic look. And the last one is make sure that you worry about some sort of stabilization for your camera. Get yourself a top handle, and I strongly recommend an Easy Rig, especially if you're doing documentary filmmaking. I can't even tell you how much I love my Easy Rig. It has helped me out so much in the past, and probably one of the most valuable pieces of gear that I've ever invested in. So that's it for today, guys. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Alex Zarfati, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Deuces.